Did you say me?
You know the one. Okay, you're far too affluent and successful for me to ask this question. But
Hello and welcome to episode 153 of the Rockstar CMO effing marketing podcast. I'm your host, Ian Truscott. I'm no rockstar, but on this weekly podcast, I chat with the true rockstars, my fabulous guests and chums that I've met on my journey from techie to CMO, sharing the marketing street knowledge that the wonderful Jason Falls recently described as a variety show for marketers. Come say hello. You can find links to me, my guests, and all the things we talk about in the show notes at rockstarcmo.com or at Rockstar CMO on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we are proud members of the Marketing Podcast Network. It's Saturday, the 11th of February. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've had a good week and you are well and staying as sane as you feel you need to be. This week in the Marketing Studio, Jeff Clark and I ponder if podcasting is right for your business. I have some fun backstage with author Dan White. And this week, Robert Rose is back in the Rockstar CMO virtual bar. But first, we need to pay the bar tab. I'll be back in a moment.
We'll be right back after this word.
We'll be right back
After this word.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Christy Heiler hosts a fantastic podcast called Own It. Christy, tell us more about the show.
Own It is all about celebrating women and non-binary advertising agency owners. We talk about buying out of the boys' club of advertising because less than 1% of ad agencies are owned by women.
And where can people subscribe?
You can find the podcast at untilyouownit.com. We're also on the Marketing Podcast Network at marketingpodcast.net. And of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Right, it's time to drop by the Marketing Studio for our weekly dose of marketing street knowledge with Jeff Clark, our resident Rockstar CMO, strategy advisor, and former research director of Forrester Sirius.
Hey, and welcome. Come on into the studio.
Thank you very much, mate, and welcome to Rockstar CMO FM for another week. How are you, Jeff?
I am doing well, and I am excited to be on a podcast because we're going to talk about podcasts in your marketing.
Yes, we didn't announce this last week, but we did hatch a plan, didn't we, after we spoke, that podcast was going to be the topic of this week. And especially as last week, it was quite a heavy topic we went into last week, and so quite a light one, I guess, if you
lighten it up.
Podcast on a light topic, yeah. But of course, the first agenda item is, and now the weather's getting better. How's the weather?
The weather is fine. It's very spring-like, and as
lovely.
Last week we were talking about Groundhog Day in the U.S., where the groundhog predicts spring, and if he was in my backyard, he would say, "Spring's here. You don't need me. See you later."
I love it. Yeah, we've had a little bit of an uptick as well in the temperatures, and a bit of sunshine today, which was nice too here in just outside Oxford. Just to because you're in Massachusetts, just in case there's new listeners that don't realise we're in different places.
That's right.
That's exciting.
We're in two places at once.
A weather show. All right, so we decided to pick on podcasting. Part of that was because recently there's been a lot of chat about. Well, apart from the fact we are on a podcast, so it's nice and meta, but there was a lot of chat about where podcasting was going. So I think that Spotify, there was a big report about how Spotify, only 7% of their total listening on Spotify was podcasts, despite having people like Barack Obama and Joe Rogan on their roster, and that they were cutting their investment, as in a lot of big tech are cutting their investment. And there was particular focus, wasn't there, on Spotify cutting their podcast investment after they made a huge splash about it last year. And we both listened to this, actually. Robert Rose, who's also on the show, and on This Old Marketing, his podcast he does with Joe Pulizzi, their actual whole podcast was called "Is There a Bear Market for Podcasting?" And he made some commentary on this, didn't he? I think that was 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
A couple of episodes ago, wasn't it? So we thought we'd tackle this and whether this was a good idea for podcasts, for businesses, particularly B2B, not for individuals like me doing this on my Saturday mornings, but whether this is a good idea for businesses. And, listeners, there are loads of podcasts that you could be listening to. I should actually drop a thing in for the Marketing Podcast Network. There are over 35 podcasts there just on marketing that you can listen to. And then I realized that, I don't know, at the top of the show, I used to say, does the world need another effing marketing podcast? So I think I've picked the wrong month to stop saying that by the sounds of things, right? Because does the world need another effing marketing podcast? And you pulled out this stat from Statistica, which is that 82 million people in the US listen to podcasts. And that's expected to rise to 100 million in 2024. So there's no shortage of listeners.
That's like 25% of our people's here listen to podcasts.
Yeah, it's amazing. And as Robert concluded on This Old Marketing, podcasting is far from dead. But is it a good channel for B2B marketing? So is creating a podcast a good idea if you're a B2B company that doesn't have one? What say you, Jeff?
I say there's some big possibilities and big caveats. I mean, when we started talking about this, I was mentioning how, someone in my family who's gotten involved in computer-aided design and manufacturing was on a podcast, and it's sponsored by a private company. And I was like, oh, wow. And then I just started thinking about other companies I know that are doing podcasting and understanding, just because of the way we work together, it's it's a big investment to do something like this. So if I'm a private company and I got my marketing, plan, where does podcasting fit in? What are the benefits? And I think I think there's some real benefits. I mean, you're projecting thought leadership. It's like your brand, plus you bring on an industry expert. Aren't we insightful? We know what's going on in the future. We can educate our customers, which is an important part of marketing, helping them understand how to solve problems, what other people are doing. Yeah. We can, for people that are existing customers, we can get deep. Like the podcast I was talking to was from a company called SolidWorks. So a lot of them, what they're doing is educating people how to use the product. It's increasing product adoption. Ultimately, I think the goal, we can go through all these various benefits, but ultimately I think with podcasting what you're trying to do is build trust with your buying audience, or maybe within your ecosystem, and you're trying to increase the propensity to buy from you as a vendor. I mean, otherwise it's not you don't do this just for the the fun of it, or contributing to the social conversation, because again there's so many different podcasts out there, people only have so much time. So if it's not focused on that I think on that thing, I think you have to think twice.
I think it's interesting that we've chosen to talk about podcasts specifically on this show, because I mean we've kind of gone from talking about marketing fundamentals at a very high level, and this is just a tactic and a channel, right? But those things that you've identified there is we want to project our thought leadership, want to educate our customers, we want people to understand our product. And I think product adoption is interesting. I think that's a good topic. It might be a good topic for us to cover actually on its own, because I think these days with SaaS technology, and a lot of what I'm hearing is
very important.
Enablement is so important. And actually you've got to, I'm going to write a blog post about this. You've got to sell and market the enablement, haven't you? Because people are just giving you their $99 a month or whatever, having a go with the product, not really discovering the whole breadth of it, and then disappearing. So it sounds like a podcast would be a good way to educate the consumer on that stuff.
Could be.
And then improving brand preference, which is when we talk about awareness, revenue, and trust, right? That's where all of that stuff is, right? So we've got some core good reasons for why we're going to do it, or got some good benefits there. So I'm still, I could be using any channel, right? So what is it that I'm going to ask myself? What do we need to go through as a B2B solution to say, is podcasting right for us? What questions should we ask ourselves?
I mean, they kind of all roll up to, what's going to make your customer or ecosystem base, follow you on a podcast, where they're going to download it from Apple or Google or wherever you happen to be hosting it. And And so, the first question I would say is, do you have a potential listening audience? So as we know, I mean, it's hard to get loyal listeners. It's hard, it's hard to understand what's that pool of people that I can capture. Is it my customers? Is it my, partners? Are there communities like developer communities? And so you start building out, there's this broad ecosystem. And so for a company, and a SolidWorks might be, I mean, somewhat familiar with them because they used to, headquarters was near where I live, but, my understanding is they have a big ecosystem. So they've got a lot of people they could potentially pull from, and you're not, it's very difficult because of where I think podcasting fits in the tactic mix. It's like, it's probably not something you're going to use to get to new customers and prospects, because they got to know you before they can know whether to download your podcast. And if there's like a particular issue you've covered on one episode, that might capture their interest. But if they say, oh, this was kind of interesting, but I'm not sure am I going to listen to everything that company has to put out.
Yeah, and I actually put a supplementary question into the notes while you were introducing just a moment ago, because I think that's one of the decisions you need to make. Because if you create your own podcast, you're creating a channel for your own existing audience, aren't you? For your own community, and those people that are going to listen to it are going to be your tribe, your core people in your tribe. Is what you're saying there, right? Whereas maybe if we're looking to expand that, then maybe we need to look at other people's podcasts and being guests and sponsors on other people's podcasts. So anyway, I've distracted you for a second. So we're wondering whether we should host a podcast as a B2B vendor. So the first thing is, do we have an audience? Do we have a core audience that are going to be interested? So what's the next thing?
Next thing is, do you have enough content for the long haul? I mean, it's like you build out an editorial calendar, and you have to be cognizant that I think you mentioned this to me last week. 40% of podcasts have 2 or less episodes. It's kind of like, well, if you're only going to do 2 episodes, it's like, why did you do it? You've got to go for more than a year and this is true, like for any radio, TV, whatever. You got to go for a span before all of a sudden the word of mouth gets around, that people say, hey, you got to listen to this, or you get enough content where somebody says, I'm going to tune into that, ABC company hosted podcast, and it's like, I'm going to look at all the shows, and if I see a fair number of things that are of my interest, then I'll subscribe, I'll follow it. If it's a one and done, then
Well, the other thing is, as a brand, I mean, to your point here, I think is, you're going to have to overcome that credibility thing. Because I think if you're a thought leader and you're creating a personal podcast, then people will want to come and listen to you. I think like any content marketing, if you're content marketing as a brand, you have an impediment in that the world is going to think you're trying to sell to them or do some Jedi mind trick on you. And it's all about that, right? So therefore, you're going to need to really demonstrate consistently good content that will overcome that friction if it's under your brand, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. I think content marketing as a discipline is a slow burn, but podcasting in particular, I think you need to be committed to, don't you, for the longer term?
Absolutely.
So the questions we're asking is, do we have an audience, and have we got the content? 2 really good questions for any content marketing strategy. So what's the next?
Who's your host? I mean, if you're hosting this, and Ian, you set a high bar as an excellent host for a podcast, and it's like, so who helps build a story that engages the listeners? When they're interviewing guests, I mean, interviewing is a skill, and there's a lot of smart people, a lot of good speakers, but they may not have an easy time. They may want to talk more than they want to actually, bring out the wisdom from the guests. And are they? And this is not necessarily a requirement, but it's part of the equation. Are they a known influencer themselves? I know one company that I follow is a Primo, and Ed Brault the CMO, has been on your podcast in the past, and he's a person who wants to be out there personally. So he's an influencer in the marketing resource management automation industry, and And I noticed that, for a time he was appearing on other people's podcasts, which he probably still does. But then now they host their own podcast, and he's the host interviewing other people. So that's,
I think that, and that's to my previous point as well, is that about your choice about whether you're going to host your own or whether you're going to sponsor or whether you're going to appear on other people's, right? Whereas, I mean, as you said, Ed's been on my show. Really nice fella, actually, and I'd recommend people. Whatever you think about a primo, I'd follow Ed, and because I'm not going to advocate another vendor. But and his podcast is great, and and as you say, he's developing that personal brand that you're going to follow, regardless of whether it's about a primo or whether it's about Ed, right?
Right.
He's got some good ideas.
And obviously that personal brand then rubs off, and the content they cover rubs off on a primo, helping to build trust in the organization.
There's another topic we should cover one day, which is the importance of personal branding for your executives. Because I've come across that a couple of times where people get dinged for having a personal brand because they think that they're trying to do too much for themselves, but it's an incredibly good asset in terms of PR for your company. And if you've got somebody with a strong personal
and when
brand.
an executive should have a personal brand and when they shouldn't, or they don't have the. So
we're coming up with.
Qualities.
So we're talking about podcasting. Whatever. We're talking about podcasting. We're coming up with great ideas.
We've got other ideas.
Podcast, which is all right. So we've got our host, we've got our audience, we've got our content. What next?
Who's your talent? And so, when I mean the talent, I mean the guests. So, do you have access to people that are interesting, speak well, can attract an audience? And this is kind of like a news story. It's like, does their name, their title, their experience, the topic, what is it that would make people say, "Oh, I got to go listen to that"? The guy, the fellow I know who was on the SolidWorks podcast. I mean, he was talking about automated machines that are automated to build other machines. I mean, it's like, I know the guy, but on the other hand, I'm like, oh my God, what's this all about? And it's like, something's got to be there, and you've got to have, as you build out the editorial calendar, you've got to have lots of those stories to work with.
Sorry, an editorial calendar? What do you mean? Oh, sorry.
Like we keep.
I think also that there's an interesting question there to ask yourself. I mean, this is probably more for people that are doing their own podcast rather than a business podcast, which is, do you have a guest type show like this one, or do you have a sort of monologue type show where somebody is just sharing, whatever it is, and do you have, if you're the vendor, is it a show that only has people from your business on it talking about various elements of your company, or do you have guests? Personally, I'd go the guest route. I also think that if you're it's a great way to engage influencers.
Oh yeah,
because you can get industry influencers on you. They'll come for the podcast, and as long as you're not too overtly salesy, they'll join, even though it's got your name above the door.
I think that's where the ecosystem, qualification is really important, because if you're, if you've got distributors, partners, systems integrators, clients who are advocates, industry analyst type info. So if you've got a big broad audience, or that's the talent pool. If you've got a big broad talent pool like that, that makes it so much easier.
It's like, and I think with customers, it's like when you have a customer come speak at your event, they may, I don't know where this sits. There's a kind of grey area with what's approved for what customers can say in terms of customer references and case studies. Often the regimented case study route, as you would say, of a printed case study, the video and all that kind of stuff, that has to go through all kind of legal and approval, sometimes depending on the organization, and often the answer is no. Whereas if you invite a customer to come speak at your event, they can say things and advocate for you in a way that they can't in a printed form. And I think podcasts sit on that same kind of thing, isn't it? In that sort of grey area. And I think if you've got a customer on to your podcast to talk about a topic, they may not say, "Oh, because clearly that wouldn't be the most boring podcast in the world if they just told you how wonderful your software is." But that just by being there, they're an advocate for your
Right.
for your brand if you're talking about something interesting.
You're
right?
creating brand association, whether they say,
Yes.
I buy SolidWorks
Yeah.
to do XYZ or not,
But just being on the podcast.
Yeah.
Just having, I don't know, that brand on your podcast, and even if you're just talking about some topic from the industry, the fact they're there is an advocacy moment, isn't it? It's an influencing moment. I think that's cool. All right. And then, so we've done 4 questions, haven't we, if I'm keeping count? So that was who's your talent, who's your candidate. So, and what's the last question?
Can you measure success in a meaningful way? Which is always the last item on most lists. But it's listeners, downloads, like you do, when you post it, you've got links to things, click-throughs on that. Those are all great, but those are all very tactical. And so ultimately, if this goes back to what, I said earlier, that ultimately you're trying to increase brand preference, building trust and loyalty among your within your customer base, your ecosystem. So that's probably the best, if there's any way to measure, as we've done this podcast, we can see, whether you're interviewing or doing like surveys of the exact audience or just overall looking in general, am I increasing brand preference? It's very hard to connect to revenue. And so to me, doing some sort of brand research is probably the best way of measuring success.
Well, yeah, and I think as well, I know that the nice thing here is, if the listener hasn't noticed, there are 5 effing questions, which is what we like.
Yeah.
But if I was to add a 6th, I'd probably put that at the beginning as well, which is, what is success for you, right? Because I think that's probably why a lot of blogs, a lot of podcasts, a lot of content marketing fails in the first quarter, is because there's an expectation it's going to go viral or it's going to have this, right? So I think that you were saying earlier on about loyal listeners and are we just talking to our existing customers, our tribe? That may only be like 150 people or 100 people. It may only be 50 or 10.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes you need to think about, well, what would it look like if I had all of those people in the room? It'd be a pretty cool gig, right?
Yeah.
It'd be good if you could get all those people in the room, or if you did a webinar on that many. So I think the success is an interesting thing here.
Yeah.
All right, so that's splendid. So those are the 5 effing questions. See, I just drop effing into everything. By the way, I don't know. I thought I might do some advertising on Twitter with Rockstar CMO. I try every now and again, and I always get knocked back because of the language that I use. And I thought it's because I said bollocks once, but I think it's because I say effing. So because I put effing in things, they're like, no, you can't advertise because you're profane. So,
gosh.
Maybe I should stop. Anyway, what sort of example? What examples are the good podcasts that you?
Yeah,
like? You just mentioned Air.
Yeah, we mentioned a couple. We mentioned SolidWorks has this Born to Design. They're computer-aided design and manufacturing. They're a Primo, the one with Ed Brault, does marketing cheat codes. I was interesting. I had picked up something else I was listening to about Accenture. So Accenture, the big consulting organization. They have 4 podcasts. One caught my attention. It was called Built for Change. When I worked at Pega, that's their tagline is "Build for Change," and Accenture was like our biggest partner, and so I was like, I wonder how that went down. And then I found out that Pega has their own Bold Stories, future focused podcast. But again, these are all companies that have a fairly large ecosystem. When you add up customers and and partners and distribution and all et cetera. So I think that they hopefully they're being successful because they're clicking all of the boxes we had mentioned before.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess in prep for the show, I should have listened to some of the others. I'm familiar with the Aprimo podcast nerds, and I think that's great because it's called Marketing Cheat Codes. It's all about marketing and tips, and that's their core audience, isn't it? So as long as you're being relevant, I do think that building machines thing that you talked about sounds fascinating. And the couple of examples, I thought I'd bring some examples to the party as well. Is HubSpot. They've always been pretty, in my mind anyway, on the cutting edge or on the front edge. I don't know if cutting edge is the right thing. Content marketing gurus would probably argue who's on the cutting edge of content marketing, but I've always found them to be right there when it comes to content marketing. From the early days of their educational blog, that's how I knew them before I was even an influencer that could help sell, that anybody would buy it. So they've launched a podcast network, which I think is indicative of where this thing is. And there's a really nice podcast that I'd recommend to people. I had the host, the CMO of Gated, on the show, Melissa, and she, I think her name, oh God. Their show is called Finding Focus. Now, their software, Gated, prevents what basically, if somebody tries to spam you, they have to give a donation to a charity that you select, right? So they can get through that gate. Yeah. And so their show is called Finding Focus, and it matches their kind of brand value of giving you focus, giving you time back out of your inbox and stuff like that. So I think it's great. And that's by Gated, Finding Focus. Anyway, so splendid. We've very talked about podcasts, and I think those some excellent questions one should ask yourself. So we're not saying you should start a podcast,
or shouldn't.
Certainly think about it.
Yeah.
And what song are we going to finish up on?
We're going to play out on this segment on Gold Dust by DJ Fresh, which is it had some nice lyrics about, you hear me coming through your speakers, you see me mashing up your airwaves, I know you can't get enough of my sound. That's what you want. Nice. If you're going to host podcasts, that's where you want to be.
I love that. I like that too. And also this idea of coming through your speakers. I love it. And by the way, I'm going to say that I remembered, but I didn't really, that the guest I had, the CMO of Gated, is Melissa Moody. So please look out for her. All right, we went over time, and I didn't mind. That was a wonderful topic. Thank you very much, Jeff. And we haven't decided what we're going to talk about next week, even though we've just told everybody that you should have an editorial strategy.
Yeah, right. Maybe we can talk about editorial strategies.
But will you be in the studio next week? All right.
We'll find something to talk
about. See you then. Have a good one.
Bye.
It's like gold dust. You hear me coming through your speakers. You see me mashing up your airwaves. I know you can't get enough of my sound. It's like gold dust. You hear me coming through your speakers. You see me blocking up your airwaves. I know you can't get enough of my sound. There's no place to hurt, so stop the fight. I'm gonna get it. All this running from me, baby, you're gonna regret it. I can understand why you can't free yourself and let it go.
Thank you, Jeff. And that was Gold Dust by DJ Fresh from 2010. Love that tune. And if you want any advice on starting your podcast, give us a shout. There are also plenty of resources and folks that can help you at the Marketing Podcast Network. I'll include all the links to them and the podcast that Jeff mentioned in the show notes. Right, time to go backstage with my guest, Dan White, a marketing and insights innovator. For nearly 30 years, Dan was a one-company man with Kantar Millward Brown, a multinational market research firm specializing in advertising effectiveness, strategic communications, media, and brand equity research. He's now sharing that experience as a branding consultant and author. I have two of Dan's books, the Smart Marketing book and the recently published Smart Branding book, which we discuss in the interview, but arrived after the interview was recorded. They are both excellent. I was delighted to get some time with Dan. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Welcome, Dan, to Rockstar CMO FM. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I love speaking to authors, and I'm delighted to have an author on the show. And we don't record video, but you can probably see behind me, I have a number of marketing books, including your own, on my desk, which we'll talk about in a second. But for people that don't know you, Dan, and haven't followed your books, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been in market research and then marketing for 33 years. Mm-hmm. I started off as an executive in Kantar. It was Millward Brown back then, understanding and measuring brand and advertising performance, and developing market research products. That's what I got into. So if you've come across Brandsy or the Kantar's link testing, then I was a part of the development of those techniques. Then I moved into marketing, but still within Kantar. So I literally was in Kantar for 30 years. Yeah. But I became Chief Marketing Officer for Millward Brown Europe, as it was then. So I became a CMO which was an eye opener. I'd been advising marketing so long, and then I was one and realised, actually how I could have done a better job beforehand. And then honestly, when you realise what's useful and what isn't, as a user.
Yeah.
And more recently, I'm a marketing trainer, so sort of best practice trainer. I do market research training for the MRS in the UK, and also marketing consultancy as well. So that's my world these days.
Cool. And is the free consultancy work and freelance work you do generally around measurement now? Is that where you tend to sit and research?
It's 50-50. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but half of it's around measurement, research practices to measure brand and marketing effectiveness. Yeah. And then the other half is actually marketing itself, actually advising on how, particularly for startups, actually, what are the principles of building a brand and effective marketing. So a combination of the two.
Yeah, cool. And as you mentioned, I mean, you've taken away like 3 pieces of my research there that I was going to ask you about in your introduction. So, and as you mentioned, and people can't see video, and there is absolutely no way from looking at you you'd guess. I mean, you must have started when you were 3. If it was 30 odd years ago.
No. I started when I was 17. What was I actually? I was 20. Yes, straight from university. Yeah. I was 20 years old. Yeah. Yes, and to be honest, I fell into the job really. I met my future wife, and we got actually engaged in the second year of university. It's one of those romances, and she took a PGCE course, a 4th year teacher training in Leicester. So all I thought was, okay, I'll follow her, as you do, and I'll find a job for a year while she's doing her degree, her postgraduate degree, so long as I can drive there from Leicester. So actually in Leicester itself, I applied for a job as all sorts of things, a graphic designer, an accountant, what was the other one? I can't remember what the other one was. And also as a market research executive in Leamington Spa, which was just within the radius of being able to drive and commute. And I got the job in Leamington Spa as a market researcher, and then it went from there really.
And it's a lovely place as well, Leamington Spa. You're near there now, aren't you? You're still.
Yeah, not far. Yeah. We still live in the region, so we're near Stratford on Avon, so in a village called Bicester. Down the road.
Yeah, lovely place. And that's strange because so you were inspired to get into marketing just simply by the geographic location of a job, which is great. And then you were
that wasn't inspiration. That was just fluke. Yeah.
And then you were a single company man, really, weren't you? Which is so rare these days. I mean, you were with Millward Brown, which got acquired by Kantar, and as you mentioned yourself, you were there 30 years. How was that experience? How did you manage to be that sort of rare beast of being somewhere just for all that time?
But it wasn't a plan at all. Like I said, I thought I'd be there for a year or two and then move on. And I guessed we'd move to London, but we never did. No, it was more that at the time when you think about this was so I started, like I said, what was it in 1990-ish. So we had, the 90s and 2000s, and that was an exciting time for market research. I think when I was trying to remember, when I joined, we were either a one country firm, but no, actually, I think we'd started to have connections with or it had bought a US company and maybe a Spanish company, but there was, only a couple of other offices around the world. But then over the next 15 years or so, 20 years, it grew and grew and grew. And after 20 years, we had offices in 70 countries. And I was part of that expansion. Right. I was helping to train, brief, develop new products, sell new products. So when you're part of a rapidly growing organization, yes, you could move on, but why would you? It was exciting. And you were learning loads and you were having to invent stuff on the fly. So I never moved. And I learned a lot and about all sorts of things, even without moving on to other companies.
Yeah, no, it's splendid. And Kantar, one of the regular guests I've had on the show, is also a market researcher, and she loves the research that comes out of Kantar. She's a huge fan, so I just thought I'd reflect that. And so, really good firm you were working with. And now, I know you as an author because that's where I discovered you, because I discovered you through Douglas Burdett's Marketing Book Podcast, which, if anybody knows me or watches my social feeds, I'm always banging on about, and I love that. And you published the Smart Marketing Book, which I have in front of me, which is a fabulous book. What inspired you to start writing the books? I mean, so you've done this big career, you've got this freelancing thing. What inspired you to write a book?
Well, I think, I suppose a couple of things. I mean, I had a lot of content. Mm-hmm. I built up a lot of content. I mean, literally, I know this is not a video podcast, but just for you, I'm showing you a typical A5 notepad, and my trusty pencil. And literally, I've had an A5 notepad and a pencil throughout that whole time for 30 years. Yeah. And whenever I kind of came across something that was interesting or new, I'd make a scribble about it. In fact, normally I'd try and turn it into a diagram or a doodle that helped me remember it. Yeah. So this is not exaggeration. Literally, when I left corporate life after 30 years, I had a stack of about 50 of these A5 notepads, which was the collection of everything I learned, and I'd been lucky enough to be exposed to so much of the best thinking about brands and advertising. I worked with, through Kantar, I had that combination, right? I had access to Kantar database and all the learnings about brands and what works and what doesn't. But also, I worked with hundreds of the biggest clients in the world, the Diageos, Unilevers and the Procter & Gamble's and all these other major organizations, and having conversations with them about what they needed and what they'd learned. And so I had this database, unfortunately in very analog graphite and paper version. And I thought, right, this is now my opportunity to turn it into a few books. I wasn't sure at the start how many books it would be, but it started off as the Smart Marketing Book. And
I really like it. And for people that haven't seen it, it's a very unique style. It's like an A5 style, isn't it? It's got a hard cover, and the illustrations in it. You do all the illustrations yourself, don't you? And they're really cool. So
I mean, to be honest, you said I was an author. Yeah, I love to hear that, but I think of myself as an illustrator who's learned how to write. Oh, nice. How to bring the illustrations, how to enhance the illustration through words. It's that way round almost. I'm a very visual person, so for me, the visualization is everything. That helps me understand and remember the thing. The words then complement that. Whereas, I'm looking behind me. I know this is an audio book. A lot of the business books I've come across, I find them hard because they're full of words and no pictures. And I know that sounds like a Philistine, but I just find it hard to just sit down and read words. And I'm sure, and I know from the feedback I've had, there are a lot of people out who go, I can read, but I just would rather a visual complement at least.
Especially with some of these topics, right? Because if you're going to implement them, you're going to have to visualize them in some way. And what I quite like with your book here is that you've kind of drawn the thing we're going to need to put on the whiteboard when we explain it to our team, aren't you? I mean, that's...
Yeah. Well, that's how it started. It started to remind me what to scribble up on the flip chart, whatever, when I was trying to explain it to other people, either to clients or later on in my career. You know how often you become an internal trainer. If you know a lot, and so I picked out the best diagrams and illustrations that helped to explain stuff, and that has been the thing that's taken off, particularly on LinkedIn, to be honest. Oh my God, people really respond to visuals that explain stuff that words don't always.
I'll include a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes, because I think, your LinkedIn is full of these illustrations of things that you've thought about. And like you say, the points come across really well in the illustrations. But if I move on to, 'cause I can't dwell on your first, I should have interviewed for you for your first book, but I'm going to move on to your latest book, which is the Smart Branding book. Again, nice tight title. I think the style of I haven't received the book yet, but I'm hoping I will have by the time this goes out. But I know you've got some issues with Amazon delivery.
I'm sure it's within a few days.
But branding is such a hot topic right now, and I love the way that you've kind of summarized that up into the same style of book. But I mean, a couple of things I wanted to ask you, and particularly in B2B, is what I'm hearing is that people are shy about talking about branding at the moment. I've even heard advice on other podcasts, which is that marketers shouldn't talk about branding with the C-suite. They should talk about other things, like turn it into value things. But what I mean, and it's seen as fluffy, which I disagree with, and I presume you do as well, because you wrote a book about it. Why is branding so important?
Well, this is a huge topic, and I'm not sure where we are on the curve. I've been obviously following this because it's my world.
Yes,
and it felt like the last at least 5 years, possibly longer, there's been a massive shift towards what people call performance marketing.
Yep.
Yeah. Which has which is associated with online and social advertising, which the ways that were typically used to measure the effectiveness of those channels had a bias, and this is what's being addressed now, towards short-termism, immediate response and long-term value building.
Yeah.
Now that is shifting as we speak, as some of the bigger advertising platforms and publishing platforms are starting to actually acknowledge more longer term methods that reflect both, the short term, but more the longer term effect of advertising. So I think the tide is already turning right now.
Cool.
And the problem, if it is I think it was a problem, is being addressed, and it's swinging back to that kind of more balanced way of looking at it. And that means that channels like out of home and TV that have been completely out of favor recently are coming back in, because actually, when you look at the long-term effects, those channels were underrepresented recently, and so the balance is coming back. But the reason is, like, brand building is about creating long-term memories, and there are certain channels like cinema is the ultimate, but audiovisual channels like TV or what do you call it? Unskippable YouTube is similar to TV, very similar to TV. Those kind of 30 seconds of telling a story are very good at building a brand that will be remembered and add value in the long term. And so now I think it's much more balanced.
Yeah, I always see it. Recently I've been describing it's like a brand. It's a multiplier of everything else you do, isn't it? So if you're doing these performance marketing activities like PPC, somebody's going to have 5 choices, 10 choices, 20 choices. Which one are they going to choose? It's going to be down to the brand or some recognition or something that you say in it, right? But it's going to be hidden. That value is going to be kind of hard to attribute, isn't it? They chose you. Yeah.
And it doesn't tend to get reflected in the way that advertising has been measured more in recent past, which is last click or whatever. But actually, like you say, it's what came before.
Yes.
The predisposition, the idea of getting your brand into the consideration set of maybe 2 or 3 brands into people's heads. That won't be reflected very well. It won't be reflected at all in short-term measurement.
Yeah.
It will be reflected if you do long-term modelling. So that's why market mix modelling is right now coming back into fashion, because people have realised that if you want to build profitability in the long term for a brand, those are relevant measures.
Isn't there's a book, isn't there, there's short on the long of it, or is it an article that I've heard Mark Ritson talk about
long and short of it?
Long and short of it. I can't remember who it's by, but that's that thinking, isn't it, that we're so wired now to those short-term gains, but we've forgotten the long-term brand building and the benefits of that.
It's by Les Binet and Peter Field. And
how can I forget Les? How can I
Yeah,
forget Les Binet?
it's essential reading.
Yeah.
It's absolutely essential because it makes people think about, well, any business has to balance short and long term. You can't survive long term if you're going to go bust this year. Fine. But if you want to succeed, then you need to think about how to build that long term. And that's where the real value comes from. And that it's a book. I think it's published by the IPA, I think, is a starting point for everyone, I think.
So we're promoting other people's books now, but let's get back to yours. Because in your book, because one of the challenges I think we've just touched on, particularly with performance marketing, is the ease of measurement, isn't it? And that's why we've it's a bit lazy, but it's easy to demonstrate to our senior colleagues that here we're making a difference. Look, here's a graph, here's a thing ticking up, and all that kind of stuff. How do you approach measuring brand? I know you talk about it in your book. I don't have your book, but I know you talk about it in there. So how does one approach measuring the brand from your perspective?
Yeah, it's quite different, really, because like you said, if you want to look at immediate response type measures, there are digital measures, the behavioral measures you can pick up on and use that. The brand is different because it's about predisposition in the brain. Yeah. So you have to measure what's in people's minds.
Yeah.
I was thinking about you sent me a few questions before, and I was thinking about a lot about this one. And I was thinking, I think the best advice I can give is that there are probably just two absolutely essential measures you need to understand whether your brand is building and your brand is going to help you deliver value. Yeah. And one is, people call it mental availability, but it's like spontaneous brand awareness, right? In other words, does the brand come easily and quickly, spontaneously to people's mind when they're thinking about buying the category?
Right.
Now that is fundamentally important. We know that leads to success. Yeah. So I just get into, can I try out this with you, right? See if this works. This probably won't work because I normally do it with a sample of at least 30, 40 people. Okay. If you were looking for a cheap mobile phone, what brands might you consider?
Cheap
one.
Well, for me, as I'm an iPhone guy, right? It'd be almost anything that isn't an iPhone. So I would probably consider like Samsung or one of those Chinese brands that nobody's ever heard of. Like one of those, like, I don't know. It'd be a brand I haven't heard of. Do you see what I mean?
You know the one, the Huawei. Okay, you're far too affluent and successful for me to ask this question. But it wasn't your current brand. Okay. What about if you're looking for a mobile phone for a child? What brand might you think of?
I don't know. It's weird. It's
a child.
Yes, I'm probably the wrong. I'm thinking of one of those Nokia phones. The ones that were really simple.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people think Nokia. They're cheaper. They're simple. They're not smartphones, but it's still a way of keeping in touch and being safe. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you go on to questions like, what mobile, if you wanted the latest, best, or most stylish one, you might say Apple or Samsung or whatever. Yeah. The point is there are all sorts of different needs out there.
Yep.
And the brands that are successful come to mind spontaneously for those, for all of those, for multiple needs, ideally. And Apple does do a job. Samsung does a decent job. Huawei does a decent job.
Huawei, that's the one. Yeah, that's the one I would have.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing for me, I think, which is the importance you're making as well, is the interesting thing there is I would I choose iPhone, but when you say who are the most stylish, who are the cutting edge, those flip phones and all that kind of stuff that are done by Samsung, I would probably identify those with that question. But my question, I obviously am not answering that question with my consumer choice, right? Is that I just get an iPhone, right? I know it's not the best phone.
No, but the thing is, there are loads of different people out there with loads of different needs, and those needs change and evolve as their family circumstances and their wealth changes. And the successful brand, the point is, you want to come to mind when people have a need. And if you want to grow your brand, you need to come to mind across a wider range than you are now.
Right.
And is why penetration is one of the most important drivers of growth rather than value and frequency, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. There is a second measure I would always recommend as well. So that would be my first measure. The second measure is just a kind of the other way around. It's like, when I present you with an idea like Huawei, I said a brand, or Apple or Samsung, just to ask you directly whether you'd consider it.
Yeah.
Because you might reject it. Now, you might reject Huawei, right? Yes, it comes to mind if you want a cheap phone. You might reject it because you don't trust it. I don't know. Or because you don't like the fact that Huawei dominate 5G and there are political connotations. Or if I ask you what brands of baby milk would you think of, you might think of Nestle, but some people still reject that because of what happened in the 90s, 2000s. So there is an overlay. So it's a combination of coming to mind and then the rational brain giving it a blessing, not rejecting it as well. So if I were those two questions come together, if I had two questions on a tracking study, spontaneous brand awareness and consideration, that will give you 80%, 90% of what you need to know about your strength of your brand.
I love it. And then we've, as we predicted, right, because I had too many big questions for 20 minutes, we're going on time. Can I quickly just ask you, from your Smart Branding book, what's the one thing you'd love people to take from it? What's the most important point you think you're making in the book?
That's a really good question.
I didn't prepare you with this one, did I? That was a mistake.
No, that's fun. I would say it relates to what I've just been talking about. People underestimate the value of just being salient, about coming to mind and not being rejected, but coming to mind and being salient or mentally available when people are thinking about buying a brand is a huge part, a huge element, a massive element of brand success, multiplied by being available. I know it's a cliche. It's Byron Sharp's thinking. It's physical availability and mental availability, but it's true. The basics right.
No, I love it. And so your book is the Smart Branding book, and that will be available on all good bookshops and some terrible ones as well. So I'm going to get to our last question, which is, we have a regular feature, the Rockstar CMO Swim Pool, our portal to marketing hell, where we throw all the bullshit, snake oil and overhyped trends that plague the industry we love. What would you chuck into our pool?
Okay, this is quite easy. It's of emotionally driven brand loyalty, if you like. Emotionally driven brand loyalty that has to go in.
Really?
It's like Room 101, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Stole it completely.
Because a question I ask in a training session, I did it this morning actually. Okay, think about assuming you're old enough to have bought 3 cars or whatever, or had 3 cars. You think about the last 3 cars you had. And I ask people, how many of you have bought the same brand 3 times? How many, and how many of you bought a different brand every time? It's remarkable. The majority, almost no one has bought the same brand for the last 3 times. Almost no one does it. When you think about it, I don't know, is it true for you? I mean, there are some people who love a certain brand and they have bought it. But I'm just thinking, what about you? Do you know?
I mean, I'm of an age where I've had a number of cars, and I completely agree. I've had a broad range of different cars depending on my mood at the time, right? So at the moment,
exactly.
Yeah.
Mine went kind of Audi, Saab, Audi, BMW, Audi, BMW, Ford. That's what I've got now. I'm looking right now. It's people are not brand loyalty in that sense. It's a myth. Things change. It's a weak force. Don't rely on it, because it's more about keeping salient, keeping relevant, continually.
So the dependency and the reliance on emotional brand attraction. I like that. Or attention. All right, that's splendid.
Right. Avoid that. Don't believe in it. Don't believe in it. It'll lead you to poor marketing actions. You'll focus too much on your your current buyers who just happen to be current buyers. They're not any more important necessarily than people who are going to buy you next time or bought you before.
Yeah, you just know them better. So
currently, yes, you have better access to them right now because you might have a database.
Yeah,
that's different. Yeah,
no, this is. I love talking to you, Dan, and it's really nice to talk to you, having read your book and heard you on other podcasts, and so thank you very much for your time on this one. Yeah. And when people spin the dial on the interwebs, where are they going to find you?
Well, according to my son and daughter, I'm quite glad now that if you put Dan White Marketing into Google, in fact, it'd be quite great if you could do that now just to check, because you know what it is? The trouble is you can't do this yourself because Google is so clever. It knows you and it knows it biases it towards results that are relevant to you. But Dan White Marketing should work. The top 2 results should send you to either LinkedIn or my website.
I wonder.
Don't just put Dan White because he is a famous mass murderer. So don't just put Dan White.
You certainly do come up, and especially with your very distinctive illustration in the images. So yes, I can attest that you do come up if you search for Dan White Marketing. I'll of course include all of your links in the show notes as well. Thank you very much for your time, Dan. I look forward to staying in touch, and I look forward to your next book. Cheers. Thank you, Dan. I love meeting the people behind my marketing book collection, and his books with Dan's illustration style are particularly nice things. I will, of course, include links to Dan and his books in the show notes. I'd encourage you to check them out. Right, it's time to wind down the week in the Rockstar CMO virtual bar. After last week's faux pas, I managed to press the right buttons in Outlook. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by my friend and content marketing guru, Robert Rose, for a cocktail and a marketing thought. Good evening, Robert. What are you drinking?
Oh, hello. It's good to be back in the bar. I see you disinvited me last week, so it was it was a little weird to not have a job on Friday night or Saturday night. So
I'm really sorry, man. I'm such a fucking idiot. I probably shouldn't say it. I heard that somebody actually listens to this podcast while they're taking their children to school, so I shouldn't swear. But I was absolutely mortified, and then I just sat in the bar on my own and told one of your stories. So
well, that's fantastic. I'm glad the bar at least got used. That's wonderful. And yeah, so it's good to be back. It's good to be back in the bar and actually be with you again. And well, this week, I thought we would do something fun. So in the interim time, since you and I last spoke, my wife has returned from a trip down in the Caribbean where she was getting to pet whales, which was unbelievable trip for her. She got to go with these. In fact, actually, they're English. They come from London. These basically, it's a whole natural. All these scientists that hold these events where you can go and actually spend time with whales and learn, and it's a whole learning expedition thing. So it's not a luxury trip by any stretch.
Oh, wow. Like a scientific thing.
It's very scientific. It's all, and so you dive with the whales and you do all the sort of, you learn, and every night there's a lecture and and she just had the most amazing time ever. But what it reminded me of was how great the Caribbean can be in various places. So this week for the bar, we have a classic mojito. Because as she was telling me, she was like, it's rum. It's basically, you don't drink tequila there. You don't drink wine. You drink rum. You drink rum when you're in the Caribbean. So I figured we'd celebrate a little bit of her accomplishment this week and have a rum drink. So, of course, what is a better rum drink than the lovely origination from Havana, Cuba, and make a mojito, which, of course, is just as simple as it gets. Fresh mint, a little lime juice, and rum, and soda if you like it, sparkly.
Nice. Yes, perfect. Well, my wife's family are from the Caribbean, so we do have often have rum in the house. And I
you do?
but on my desktop bar, unfortunately.
Yes, of course. Most English of rums, I'm sure.
I have the most English of rums. And unfortunately, and also mentioning my wife, it's actually her birthday today. So happy birthday to my wife, who doesn't listen to the podcast. But there you go. So I will go with the most English of rums. Some nice Hendrick's gin, which we've learnt actually comes from Scotland. Oh, I presume with your mojito, there's a nice bit of ice being chucked into that glass, yes? Good. Well, I chucked in some glasses. So I'm going to chuck in the most English of rums. And then you mix that up with some mint and some...
Yeah, some people like to muddle a little bit of the mint in the glass. Yeah. Some people just put in some fresh mint leaves, depending on how minty you like your drink, and lime juice being sort of the key other ingredient. And then, of course, many of the recipes call for a simple syrup or something like that. And as we've talked about many times in the bar, I'm not a fan of simple syrup, so I just go straight up with a little soda water or a little flat water, depending on whether you want it fizzy or not. And just
I'm going with tonic water, which the wonderful people at Fever Tree have put some cucumber in, which is the most English of mints. So there we go. Let me give this a try.
Cucumber. Yes. So minty.
Yeah. This is delicious, Robert. I could drink one of these every week. And what are we calling this?
We're calling this a mojito. Although I think we might call yours a ginito.
Ginito. You'll be pleased to know that while you were away last week, I also had a gin and tonic. So there we go.
I hope good.
I'm drinking alone, telling stories alone.
Consistency is at least good there.
Yes. And also last week, I transported us away to the most lonely of bars, which is the International Hotel, where you find the single business traveller. So I'm hoping you're going to take us somewhere more interesting, as it's the two of us. Where are we going this week?
Well, of course, I mean, we have to go where my wife just returned from, which I learned all about when I heard she was going there. Of course, I did all the reading because that's what I'm going to do, because my wife is traveling to some strange country. And it's Dominica. Not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, but Dominica. Which is, of course, described as the nature island. And as my wife would tell you, meets up to that reputation. Very quiet little island down in the southern Caribbean. And it is beautiful there. And so her hotel, which apparently is the same hotel where they filmed the Pirates of the Caribbean movie.
Oh, wow.
And so she stayed at that same hotel for their little lodging as well. So I figured we'd stay there. And it was, I mean, she took pictures. It was right on literally steps away from the water on the beach. So I think we sit outside our little cabana room and have some mojitos and stick our toes in the water.
Love it. All right. I love that. And then while we're sitting there with our toes in the water, and inevitably when it's you and me, the conversation turns to marketing. What are we going to be talking about this week?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about, so of course your listeners know I do a lot of work with the Content Marketing Institute, and we do research every year, and the B2C, the consumer side of things research was just released last week. It would have been something we talked about last week had I been invited to the bar. But
fucking Outlook.
But we'll
damn you.
But we'll talk about it now, which is and really there were some very interesting and I would say distinct challenges that sort of came forward in the research itself. And the main one, and this is what we can chat a little bit about, is that for most B2C organizations, they're still looking at content marketing as a tactic within a campaign rather than an operation. And what I mean by that is that for most B2C organizations, they're still seeing, and by the way, seeing some levels of success here, which is really treating it like an ad campaign rather than as an operation that should exist over the length of time. And some of the struggles that came out of that, some of the challenges, even as comes into the research, talk about the idea, well, we don't really understand our audience. We don't really, it's tough to get budget for this because it competes with other needs like lead generation and e-commerce and some of those things. And then one of the most interesting things to me was the organization's biggest content marketing challenge. And the number one thing that came up was that, and it was almost 60% of the B2C marketers, it was creating content that appeals to different kinds of target audiences. In other words, really not understanding how do we develop consistent value with our audiences over time. And all of those challenges, they really center on this idea of not treating content marketing as an operation, right? As an operational strength rather than as a tactic within a paid campaign. And I think this, for those content marketers out there that work in B2C, what we see very often, the success is when they can successfully transform their team or their little part of the world, or, you know, the 4 people in the cubes around them, whatever their sort of organizational structure is, and turn it more into, you know, a media operation. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that often gets lost in the idea of content marketing is, you know, we often talk about, oh, we have to be more like a media company. We have to act more like a media company. We have to look like a media company. And what people think of, especially on the B2C side, is this idea of we have to market ourselves like a media company. And that's not it. That's not it. It is, how do you operate? How do you create the internal infrastructure and operations and governance models like a media company does? In other words, how do you treat content with the same multi-use, long-term investment, asset-oriented idea that a media company does? That's the real difference here. And so it's really about how do we create those different processes in our organization that can mean the difference between success and failure in content marketing. And the new research just really sort of illustrated that.
Right. I love the research. I mean, I know the CMI the research for B2B I tend to obviously pull on that because I'm from B2B as well. So this B2C sounds really interesting. And so was there a really marked difference then between the organizations that took these two different approaches?
Well, indeed. I mean, certainly the obvious one, which is you know, organizations that are targeting businesses. So read into that longer sales cycles, multi-touch sales cycles, all of that. B2C being much more transactional, focused on consumer marketing, et cetera, and really a much higher lean into e-commerce as well as the transactional nature of selling to consumers. And so those are the biggest differences between the two audiences. And so ultimately they are different from an operational standpoint. You know, a lot of people will say, oh, B2B and B2C are the same. We're still selling to humans. Well, yes, that is true. But the operational differences are distinct. There are differences in the ways that you construct a marketing operation when you're a B2C company versus when you're a B2B company. And that's just a fact. And so the difference is what were interesting to me in the way that these folks answered the questions was in exactly that, right? The operational differences. That's what interested me, because other stuff like how much do you use social media and how much, you know, do you use marketing automation and stuff like that? Those were very similar across both B2B and B2C. But what was the marked difference was really in how the construct of the team and the treatment of the operation of content really is.
Right. So very different audience there and different, like you say, the output is different. But would you say that if you're creating if you're thinking of yourselves as a media company within your organization, from a B2C perspective or a B2B perspective, it's the same kind of discipline you need to create within your business? I don't know why I'm focusing on B2B versus B2C, but I'm interested in the other thing is where you saw people that did create these media companies, there was a marked difference in their success, I think you were saying too.
Indeed. I think you know, the difference from an operational standpoint, it's still, you know, a lot of people will say, well, where should content marketing as an operation report into, right?
Yeah.
And I would say, if we were to look at it, what we typically see is that B2B companies, it typically is in more of the lead generation, sales enablement part of the business. And in B2C, it is typically more in the comms and PR and brand side of the business. But that's anecdotal at best, right? I mean, I don't think there's an empirical model that says, and certainly there's no right way to do it, because we see successful companies doing it. You know, when people ask where should content marketing report into, my answer is yes. So you know, I don't care where it reports into, as long as it reports into somewhere and is a real thing. So we can see it work anywhere, but really there are trends, I guess, because of the differences in the way that you approach things. You know, it tends to approach things more, you know, at that higher level. There's a lot more marketing at the higher level of brand and reach when it comes to B2C, because of the obvious reason. Your audiences your TAM tends to be bigger. They tend to be more spread out. It tends to be a little more difficult to pierce the noise because, there's many more competitors, or there's many more competition for that audience's attention. So B2C tends to be a little more difficult at that reach perspective from the breadth of audience you're trying to reach. But ultimately it gets down to the same, which is, okay, we got to get them into our sphere of influence. And once we get them there, then now we can start marketing and selling to them.
So the media company element, that core piece is going to be very similar approach.
That's right.
But
that's why you see B2C company like Lego can create the Lego movie and make it successful, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense in the world for SAP to create the SAP movie, right? There's too few people that are going to care about that. But for Lego, it makes a lot of sense because it's kids, right, and parents.
No, I love it. No, that's great. So, so I'll include a link to that. Actually, I presume it's linkable, right? The that research that you refer to on the Content Marketing Institute website.
It is right there. It is right there, front and center for everyone to consume and enjoy and love and laugh. It makes great sleeping material. I will tell you that.
Well, I'll read it on the plane back from out this wonderful idyllic Caribbean location that you chose to discuss it.
Which is exceedingly hard to get to, by the way. Just as a total side note. There's only one flight that goes every other day from Miami. So if you live in LA, you have to fly all the way across the country to Miami.
Oh, good Lord.
To basically fly all the way back across the Gulf of Mexico and down to Dominica.
Oh, my God.
And then you have to stay an extra day when you don't want to stay, because that one flight only leaves every other day. So you have to leave on a day that flight is going back to Miami so that you can actually fly back across the country back to Los Angeles again.
I love it, man. Well, I mean, it sounds like it was well worth it, so that sounds great.
Oh, but I'll include it. Yeah, she had the best
time. Excellent. Well, I'll include a link to that report in the show notes. And when people are looking for your observations of how to create your internal media company, where would they find those?
Well, they would probably find it on our little hovel on the web, which is improving every day, which is contentadvisory.net. And we have a new little newsletter that we've been putting out, which is also available off the website. So click into any of our blogs, and you can subscribe to our what we're calling The Experience. It's our new newsletter that is wonderful, and it connects right into the Experience Advisor community that we've talked a little bit about here before, and that you're a member of. So would love to come and visit.
Yeah, all the cool kids are doing newsletters at the moment. I love it. All right. And when people spin the dial on the interwebs, where are they going to find you?
They'll find me mostly on LinkedIn these days. I'm spending a lot of time on LinkedIn, so would love to connect with everybody there. And still on my little bit of a Twitter ban, although I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about, is it even productive to be off of Twitter or on Twitter? So I'm still debating that quite heavily.
Yeah, you've got to be objective, haven't you, on these things? I think I heard you talking about it on This Old Marketing in the last episode about, you've got to use it for yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. You've got to have a reason, and I don't have a reason right now, and I'm not missing it. So
that's cool.
It's interesting.
All right. Well, I'm sure that Twitter is missing you, Robert. And talking of missing you, I'll try not to But will you be in the bar next week?
Yeah, assuming I get an invite, I will definitely be there. Yeah.
All right, mate. I'll see you then.
Cheers.
Cheers, buddy. Bye-bye. Thank you, Robert. I think you'll agree the bar is a better place with Robert in it. And I recommend taking a look at the research from the Content Marketing Institute. It's always been really interesting stuff. So that's a wrap on episode 153 of the Rockstar CMO effing marketing podcast. Thanks to Jeff, Dan and Robert for sharing their insight, and to you for dropping a dime into your podcasting jukebox, selecting our track and jiving along with us. Please let us know what you think. You can contact us through our website, rockstarcmo.com. Catch us on the socials. We are Rockstar CMO just about everywhere. Or leave a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. We've got a few recently, so thank you very much for that. Or just keep listening. I'm glad you're here. Next week, Jeff Clark will be back in the marketing studio. I go backstage for a fascinating chat with another author, Emmanuel Prost. And Robert Rose will be back in the virtual bar. Until then, have a great week, and I hope you'll again join us next week here on Rockstar CMO FM.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.